Some rooms don't need alarms to feel dangerous. This was one of them. The diplomatic chamber floated in perfect equilibrium 300 miles above the nearest habitable world, its gravity tuned just slightly lighter than Earth standard, as if encouraging everyone inside to tread carefully, or not at all, while Ambassador Lyra Vera stood at the center of it, composed, precise, and entirely in control of a negotiation that had already lasted 9 hours and was approaching the polite edge of failure, her voice steady as she translated intent through layers of protocol, her long, elegant ears angled in a neutral position that meant she was listening more than she was speaking, which, in this room, was the closest thing to power anyone could display without raising suspicion, and behind her, exactly one step to the left, stood Ethan Cole, human, bodyguard, and according to every official record in the system, entirely unremarkable, which was exactly how he preferred it, because unremarkable people were rarely asked complicated questions, and complicated questions tended to lead to complicated consequences, and he had already had enough of those to last several lifetimes. So he stood still, hands relaxed, posture balanced in a way that suggested he trusted the floor to stay where it was, which was not always a safe assumption on stations like this, and listened to the conversation drift back and forth like a slow-moving current, trade routes, access corridors, mutual oversight, all the phrases that sounded reasonable until you looked at what they actually meant, and he found himself quietly counting the seconds between pauses, a habit he had picked up somewhere along the way, though he couldn't remember exactly where, because memory, like gravity, was something he had learned not to rely on too much. And across the chamber, the delegation from Karth Dominion watched with a patience that felt less like diplomacy and more like evaluation, their leader tall, composed, and very still, which in most species meant calm. But here meant something closer to waiting, and Ethan noticed the way their gaze moved, not over Lyra, not over the advisors, but occasionally, briefly, toward him, as if something in the room didn't quite fit the pattern they expected. And then the moment passed, conversation resumed, and everything returned to the carefully constructed illusion of control, Lyra finishing a point with measured clarity, her tone suggesting cooperation while her posture suggested limits. A balance she maintained with the kind of discipline that came from years of being the most dangerous person in any room without ever needing to prove it, and Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was familiar, because he understood that particular kind of restraint better than he cared to admit, and for a while, nothing happened, which in places like this was often when everything important was about to begin, and then, without warning, the Karth leader stopped speaking mid-sentence, not pausing, not hesitating, but stopping, like a system that had just encountered something it could not immediately process, and slowly, deliberately, turned their head toward Ethan Cole, and for the first time since the meeting began, the room felt smaller, as if the air itself had decided to pay attention, and Ethan, who had been very good at not being noticed, realized with quiet certainty that something had just gone wrong in a way no protocol could fix. No one spoke, which was unusual for a room designed to translate thought into language as efficiently as possible, and yet the silence held, stretching just long enough to become noticeable, then long enough to become intentional, as if every species present had quietly agreed that saying the wrong thing now would be worse than saying nothing at all, and Ambassador Lyra Vera felt it before she understood it. A subtle shift in the air behind her, not a movement, not a sound, but an absence of the normal background confidence that came with being the most composed presence in the room, and that alone was enough to make her turn, not quickly, not sharply, but with the controlled precision of someone who did not react unless reaction was necessary, her gaze passing over Ethan Cole with the same brief acknowledgement she had given him 100 times before, except this time it did not pass. This time it paused, because the Karth leader was still looking at him, not with hostility, not even with curiosity, but with something far less comfortable, recognition without context, like seeing a familiar pattern in the wrong place. And Ethan noticed that too, because noticing things was what had kept him employed for as long as he had been, and he resisted the instinct to adjust his stance, to make himself smaller or more forgettable, because experience had taught him that once attention settled, movement only made it sharper. So he did the opposite. He remained exactly as he was, balanced, still, as if the room could rearrange itself around him and he would not feel the need to follow. And that, more than anything, seemed to confirm something the Karth delegation had not wanted to confirm, their leader's posture tightening by a fraction, a small, almost imperceptible shift that carried more meaning than any spoken threat, and one of their advisors leaned in, speaking in a low tone that the translation field chose not to prioritize, which meant most of the room heard only the cadence and none of the content. But Ethan caught enough of the rhythm to recognize hesitation, and hesitation, in a room like this, was the first sign that control was slipping. Lyra's ears angled slightly forward, a subtle deviation from neutrality that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not trained to read it. And her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured, and just a degree cooler than before. "Is there an issue with my security detail?" she asked, not as a question, but as a correction, a reminder that the structure of the conversation had not changed, even if the tone had, and the Karth leader did not answer immediately, which in itself was an answer, their gaze remaining fixed on Ethan as if recalculating something they had already decided was not worth calculating. And then, finally, they spoke, their voice lower now, stripped of the performative diplomacy it had carried before. "That human," they said slowly, each word placed with deliberate care. "Where did you acquire him?" And the phrasing landed in the room like a misplaced object, drawing attention not because it was loud, but because it did not belong, and Lyra felt the question more than she heard it, because it implied something she had not yet considered, something that did not fit within the parameters she had established, and for the first time since the meeting began, she did not immediately respond, her eyes returning to Ethan, not as a background element, not as a tool, but as a variable she had failed to account for. And Ethan met her gaze briefly, not challenging, not deferential, just present. And in that brief exchange, something shifted, small but undeniable, like a line being redrawn in a place no one had noticed before, and the room, still holding its breath, waited to see who would acknowledge it first. Lyra did not answer right away, which was the first true break in rhythm the room had seen all day, and in diplomatic environments, rhythm was control, and control was everything. So when it faltered, even slightly, people noticed, even those who pretended not to, and Ethan could feel the shift ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable, like a pressure change before a storm that might or might not arrive. And he kept his posture steady, resisting the instinct to fill the silence, because silence, he had learned, was often more useful than anything he could say, especially when others were already trying to understand something they could not yet define. And the Karth leader took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate, the kind of movement that tested space rather than claimed it, their gaze never leaving Ethan as if proximity might clarify what distance had obscured. And several members of the surrounding delegations adjusted almost imperceptibly, a half-inch shift of stance, a slight repositioning of hands, small reactions that indicated awareness without admitting concern, and Lyra finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying a sharper edge now. "He is assigned through standard channels," she said, each word precise, controlled, and entirely true in a way that avoided being complete, and the Karth leader inclined their head slightly, acknowledging the answer without accepting it. "Standard channels do not produce anomalies," they replied, their tone neutral but their posture no longer relaxed, and the word anomaly settled into the room like an unexpected variable, drawing attention not because it was dramatic, but because it suggested something beyond classification, and Ethan almost smiled at that, not visibly, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for him to recognize the pattern, because he had heard variations of that word before, in rooms that felt very similar to this one. Rooms where people preferred their reality predictable and their risks clearly labeled, and he understood why the Karth leader was unsettled, because Ethan was not doing anything. And that was exactly the problem, because in situations where tension rose, people expected reactions, they expected signs, movement, adjustment, something that fit within the framework of known behavior, and Ethan was offering none of that, just stillness, balanced and quiet in a way that did not align with what a human bodyguard was supposed to be, and Lyra's gaze lingered on him again, longer this time, her ears angling just slightly, not enough to signal emotion openly, but enough to indicate focus, calculation, and for the first time, uncertainty, and she realized, with a clarity she did not particularly enjoy, that she did not actually know the man standing behind her, not beyond the file, not beyond the assignment. And that realization did not frighten her, but it did something worse. It disrupted the assumption that she controlled all relevant variables in the room, and that was not a comfortable position for someone in her role. And the Karth leader exhaled slowly, a controlled release that carried more weight than any raised voice. "We have encountered your kind before," they said, not to Lyra, but to the room, to the space itself, as if stating a fact that did not require permission, not often, and not by accident. And a faint murmur passed through the chamber, quickly suppressed, but impossible to fully erase, because now the conversation had shifted away from trade and into something far less structured, and Ethan felt the attention settle more firmly on him. Not hostile, not yet, but cautious, evaluative, the kind of attention reserved for things that might change outcomes in ways no one had planned for. And Lyra's voice, when she spoke again, was quieter, more controlled, but no longer dismissive. "Clarify," she said, and it was not a command, not entirely. And the Karth leader's gaze flickered briefly to her before returning to Ethan. "Deathworld origin," they said, the words measured, deliberate, and when they landed, the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because the room did not react, it did not question, it did not respond. It simply stopped, as if every system present had paused to recalculate the same impossible variable at the same time. And Lyra felt it then, the full weight of what she had not seen, her eyes fixed on Ethan, no longer as a background presence, no longer as a tool, but as something else entirely, something she had failed to identify. And Ethan, after a brief moment, tilted his head just slightly, as if acknowledging the accuracy of the statement without feeling the need to confirm it. And that, more than anything, was what made the silence hold. No one corrected the statement, which in a room built on precision was the closest thing to confirmation anyone was going to get, and the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt occupied, as if the idea itself had weight and had just settled across every surface, pressing gently but insistently against thought. And Lyra became aware of something she had not noticed before, not in the data, not in the reports, but in the way Ethan existed in space, the way he did not adjust when attention shifted toward him, the way his breathing remained even, unhurried, unaffected by the subtle tightening of posture that had spread through the chamber like a shared instinct. And she realized, with a clarity that was both inconvenient and undeniable, that she had been reading him incorrectly from the moment he entered her service, not as a threat, not even as an asset, but as something manageable, something predictable. And that assumption now felt less like a mistake and more like a blind spot she had never thought to examine. And across from her, the Karth leader took another measured step, then stopped, not because distance had been closed, but because something in their internal calculation had reached a limit, and their voice, when they spoke again, had lost the last trace of casual tone. "You brought him into a negotiation chamber," they said, not accusing, not yet, but emphasizing a fact that carried implications the room was only beginning to understand. And Lyra did not respond immediately, not because she lacked an answer, but because she was evaluating which answer still made sense in a situation that had shifted without her consent. And Ethan, still standing just behind her shoulder, allowed himself the smallest exhale, not audible, not visible, but enough to acknowledge that the conversation had reached a point where pretending not to exist was no longer an option. And he did not step forward, did not interrupt, did not offer explanation, because explanation had a way of making things worse when the room was already trying to define you on its own. And he had learned, through experience he did not particularly enjoy remembering, that letting others arrive at the correct conclusion often produced more stable outcomes than giving them the answer directly. And the chamber seemed to adjust around that realization, the translation field humming a fraction lower, the ambient systems recalibrating to a tension they had not been designed to measure. And Lyra finally spoke, her voice controlled, but no longer dismissive. "He is here to ensure my safety," she said, and the statement was accurate, but it sounded different now, as if the meaning had shifted without the words changing. And the Karth leader inclined their head slightly, acknowledging the structure of the sentence while rejecting its implication. Your safety, they repeated, and there was something almost reflective in the way they said it, as if the concept itself required reconsideration, and a quiet movement passed through the outer ring of delegates. Not retreat, not quite, but a careful redistribution of space, the kind that happened when individuals decided, independently and at the same time, that proximity might no longer be neutral. And Lyra noticed that too, the widening of distance that had not been requested but was nonetheless occurring, and her gaze returned to Ethan, not searching for confirmation, but for understanding, and for the first time since she had met him, she asked a question without formulating it aloud, her expression tightening by a fraction, her posture adjusting in a way so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not know what to look for. And Ethan met her eyes again, briefly, calmly. And there was no apology there, no attempt to soften the reality that had just been introduced into the room, only a quiet acceptance of it, as if this outcome had always been inevitable, and he had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. And that, more than the word itself, more than the reaction it had caused, was what made the atmosphere settle into something new, something heavier, something that no longer belonged entirely to diplomacy. And the Karth leader, after a moment, spoke. Once more, their tone now carrying a level of respect that had not been present before. Then you should be aware, they said carefully, that his presence changes the nature of this discussion. And Lyra did not look away from Ethan as she replied, her voice steady, but undeniably different. I am beginning to understand that, she said, and for the first time since the meeting began, the balance of the room shifted in a way no one had planned for. The room did not recover, which was unusual, because most diplomatic spaces were designed to absorb disruption and return to equilibrium within seconds. But this time the equilibrium did not return, it adjusted, and that distinction mattered, because instead of relaxing, the delegates recalibrated, their attention no longer distributed evenly across the discussion but subtly, persistently anchored to a single point behind Ambassador Lyra Vera, and Ethan could feel it in the way conversations hesitated before continuing, in the way movements were measured twice before being made once. And he remained still, not because stillness was his default, but because it was the most honest response to a situation that had already revealed more than he would have chosen. And Lyra understood that now in a way she had not moments before, her awareness expanding to include variables she had previously dismissed as irrelevant, and she found herself reevaluating not only Ethan, but the assumptions that had led her to place him there in the first place, because standard channels did not produce anomalies, and yet here one stood, quiet, composed, and entirely uninterested in correcting the perception forming around him, which suggested either confidence or indifference, and neither was particularly reassuring. And across the chamber, the Karth leaders shifted their stance, not retreating, but no longer advancing, a decision that carried more weight than any aggressive gesture could have, because it acknowledged a boundary that had not been formally established, and their voice, when it returned, was careful, deliberate, as if each word was being tested before release. You have altered the parameters of this meeting, they said, and the statement was not an accusation, but it was not neutral either. It was an observation with consequences, and Lyra inclined her head slightly, accepting the premise without conceding fault. The parameters were always subject to interpretation, she replied, her tone regaining some of its earlier composure, though now it carried a new layer, one shaped by awareness rather than assumption. And Ethan almost smiled again at that, because it was a good answer, not perfect, but effective, and effectiveness was usually enough to keep conversations from collapsing entirely. And yet the room did not fully accept it, because acceptance required certainty, and certainty was currently in short supply. And one of the secondary delegates, positioned just outside the main exchange, shifted their weight back by a fraction, creating a gap that had not existed before, a small space that others quickly mirrored without acknowledging why. And Lyra noticed that too, the quiet redistribution of distance that signaled a collective decision no one had voiced, and she felt a brief, unfamiliar sensation that she recognized, after a moment, as adjustment, not loss of control, but the recognition that control now required a different approach. And her gaze moved to Ethan again, not questioning, not demanding, but measuring, as if she were finally seeing the full outline of something that had been partially obscured, and Ethan met that gaze with the same steady calm he had maintained since the beginning, offering no new information, no reassurance, only presence, and that, more than anything, forced her to draw her own conclusions. And the Karth leader observed the exchange in silence for a moment, before speaking again, their tone quieter now, but carrying a weight that settled deeper into the room. "We will proceed," they said, and the phrasing was intentional, not a return to normal, but an agreement to continue under revised understanding. And Lyra nodded once, a controlled acknowledgement that signaled acceptance of the shift without fully defining it. And the discussion resumed, but not as it had before, because now every statement, every pause, every glance was filtered through a new context, one that included the quiet, unmoving figure standing just behind her. And for the first time since the meeting began, Lyra adjusted her position by a fraction of an inch, not away from Ethan, but closer, a movement so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not already paying attention. And in a room where attention had become the most valuable resource, that movement did not go unnoticed at all. The conversation resumed, but it no longer flowed. It moved, carefully, like something navigating a narrow space where a wrong step would not cause immediate damage but would be remembered. And that difference changed everything. Because now every delegate in the chamber was no longer simply negotiating terms. They were negotiating awareness, measuring not just what was said but what was implied. And Ethan could feel that shift settle into place with the same quiet certainty he had learned to trust over years of standing in rooms where he was not supposed to matter. And he remained still, not out of habit, but because movement would suggest intention, and intention was something he preferred to leave undefined for as long as possible. And Lyra adjusted to the new rhythm faster than most, her voice regaining its structure, her posture returning to a version of control that accounted for the unknown rather than ignoring it. And she spoke with the same clarity as before, but now there was a precision in her tone that had not been necessary earlier, as if she were choosing each word not only for its meaning but for its effect on a room that was listening differently. And the Karth leader responded in kind, their statements measured, their pauses deliberate. The negotiation continuing on the surface while something else unfolded just beneath it, something quieter, more instinctive, and far more difficult to ignore. And one of the outer delegates shifted again, this time not back, but sideways, creating a line of sight that avoided Ethan without appearing to do so. And that was when it became clear that the room had begun to organize itself around him, not openly, not dramatically, but in the subtle geometry of space that people adjusted when they sensed a variable they could not control. And Ethan noticed it all, cataloging without reacting, because reacting would turn observation into participation, and he had no intention of participating in a conversation that had not been directed at him. And yet the conversation kept circling back, not through words, but through attention, through the way glances lingered a fraction longer than necessary, through the way silence followed certain statements, as if the room was checking for something that had not yet happened. And Lyra felt that too. The way her own awareness kept returning to the presence behind her, not as a distraction, but as a factor that influenced everything else. And she realized, with a clarity that was both sharp and inconvenient, that her role in the room had shifted, not in authority, but in context, because now she was not simply the most composed individual in the chamber. She was also the one standing closest to something no one else fully understood, and that proximity carried its own weight. And the Karth leader spoke again, their voice steady but lower than before. "We will adjust our expectations," they said, and the statement was simple, but it landed with significance, because expectation was the foundation of negotiation, and adjusting it meant acknowledging that the original framework no longer applied. And Lyra inclined her head once more, accepting the shift without comment, because commenting would require explanation, and explanation would require information she did not yet possess. And Ethan, hearing that, allowed himself a small internal acknowledgement, not satisfaction, not relief, just recognition that the situation had stabilized in a way that did not require immediate correction. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to settle into this new equilibrium, the kind that was not comfortable, but functional. And then, almost imperceptibly, The Karth leader's gaze returned to Ethan again, not searching this time, not questioning, but measuring, as if confirming something that had already been decided, and they spoke, not loudly, not for the room, but just enough for the silence to carry it. "You are very still," they said, and the observation, simple as it was, drew the attention of every mind present, because it was not about behavior, it was about deviation, and Lyra did not interrupt, did not redirect, because she wanted to hear the answer, not as a diplomat, but as someone who had just realized she had been standing beside a question she had never thought to ask. And Ethan, after a brief pause that was not hesitation but consideration, shifted his gaze slightly, meeting the Karth leader's eyes, directly for the first time, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, unhurried, and entirely unremarkable in tone. "It helps," he said, and he did not elaborate, and somehow that lack of elaboration carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have, because the room, already recalibrating, understood that whatever he meant by that, it was not something they were prepared to fully interpret, and the silence that followed was different again, not tense, not uncertain, but aware in a way that suggested the conversation had moved beyond its original purpose and was now something else entirely. No one commented on his answer, which was telling, because in a room where every statement was usually dissected, translated, and repositioned for advantage, the lack of response meant that no one present was confident enough to define what he had just implied, and that uncertainty spread quietly, not as fear, not even as concern, but as a recalibration of expectation that touched every corner of the chamber. And Lyra felt it settle into her awareness with a clarity that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, because the conversation had shifted beyond negotiation and into something far less structured, something that did not follow protocol or hierarchy, and yet influenced both. And she found herself adjusting again, not outwardly, not in a way that would signal loss of composure, but internally, revising assumptions that had once been stable. And she spoke, her voice steady, controlled, but carrying a new intent that had not been present before. "We will continue," she said, not to the room, not even to the Karth leader, but as a declaration of structure, a way to reassert direction in a space that had begun to drift, and the Karth leader inclined their head in acknowledgement, though their attention did not fully return to the negotiation, not entirely, because something more relevant had taken its place, and that relevance stood quietly behind Lyra, unchanged, unreactive, and entirely present, and Ethan understood that without needing to confirm it, because the shift in attention had a weight he recognized, the kind that did not fade quickly, the kind that stayed even after conversations moved on, and he adjusted nothing, because adjustment would imply response, and response would invite further attention, and he had no interest in accelerating a process that was already unfolding at its own pace. And the outer delegates had settled into a new formation now, subtle but consistent, maintaining a respectful distance that had not been requested but was clearly intentional. And Lyra noticed that as well, the way space had reorganized itself around a variable no one had formally acknowledged, and she realized, with a quiet precision that matched the environment she operated in, that influence did not always require action. Sometimes presence alone was sufficient. And that realization carried implications she was not yet ready to fully explore, and the Karth leader spoke again, their tone measured, but carrying a level of consideration that had not been extended before. "Your selection process is unconventional," they said, and the pause within the sentence was not hesitation, but careful choice, and Lyra allowed herself a brief, controlled breath before responding. "Effective selection often appears unconventional from the outside," she replied, and this time, the statement was not only for the negotiation, it was for herself as well, a way of reframing a situation that had shifted beyond expectation, and Ethan heard that, not the words themselves, but the adjustment beneath them, and he recognized it as adaptation, the kind that allowed people to maintain control even when the variables changed, and he respected that, quietly, without comment, because respect did not require acknowledgement, and the room, still balanced in its new configuration, allowed the exchange to continue, though now every statement carried a secondary weight, a layer of meaning that extended beyond trade and into perception, and the Karth leader's gaze returned once more, not searching, not questioning, but confirming, as if ensuring that what they had identified remained consistent, and Ethan met that gaze again, briefly, not challenging, not avoiding, simply present. And in that moment, something settled, not resolved, but accepted, a silent agreement that whatever he represented, it was real, and it was not changing, and Lyra, watching that exchange without appearing to, felt the final piece of her earlier assumption shift into place, because she understood now that she had not brought a simple bodyguard into the chamber. She had introduced a variable that altered the behavior of everyone present, and that realization did not unsettle her. Not in the way it might have earlier. Instead, it sharpened her focus, because if the nature of the discussion had changed, then so would her approach, and for the first time since the meeting began, she did not simply continue the negotiation, she guided it, subtly redirecting the flow, adjusting emphasis, leveraging the quiet awareness that had settled into the room, and the others responded, not openly, not consciously, but in the way their tone shifted, their pace adjusted, their resistance softened by a fraction, and Ethan noticed that too. The way the conversation bent, slightly, around a presence that had not moved, and he allowed himself a single, quiet thought, not of satisfaction, but of recognition. Because this was how it always happened, not through force, not through display, but through the simple, undeniable fact of being something the room could not ignore, and the silence, though less absolute now, remained just beneath the surface, ready to return the moment anyone forgot what had already been revealed. The negotiation did not return to what it had been. It evolved, and the difference was subtle enough that no one acknowledged it aloud, but clear enough that everyone adjusted without being told, and Lyra felt that adjustment settle into her control like a new instrument she had not expected to play, her voice steady, precise, but now carrying a weight that extended beyond diplomacy. Because every word she spoke was no longer evaluated on its own merit, it was measured against the presence behind her, and that presence did not move, did not speak, did not assert, and yet influenced every outcome in the room. And she understood that now with a clarity that sharpened her instincts rather than disrupting them, and she leaned into it, not overtly, not in a way that would signal manipulation, but in the careful calibration of tone, pacing, and silence that defined high-level negotiation. And the Karth leader responded accordingly. Their earlier resistance softened not into agreement, but into caution, and caution was easier to work with than opposition, because it slowed decisions, introduced space, created openings, and Lyra used those openings with practiced precision, guiding the conversation through points that had previously stalled, redirecting emphasis without drawing attention to the shift, and the outer delegates followed that movement unconsciously, their responses aligning with the new rhythm, their objections less immediate, their counterpoints more measured, as if the room itself had decided that escalation was no longer the preferred option, and Ethan observed all of this without changing his stance, because the pattern was familiar, not in detail, but in structure, the way environments recalibrated around variables they could not fully define, and he allowed the process to unfold without interference, because interference would collapse the subtle advantage that had formed, and subtlety, in situations like this, was often more effective than anything more direct. And the Karth leader spoke again, their tone controlled, but carrying a nuance that had not been present before. Your position is more stable than we anticipated, they said, and the phrasing was deliberate, acknowledging a shift without fully explaining it, and Lyra inclined her head slightly, accepting the observation without confirming its source. Stability is often a matter of perspective, she replied, and this time, the statement held an edge of quiet certainty that resonated differently than before, and the room responded to that certainty, not consciously, not explicitly, but in the way attention settled, in the way tension redistributed into something more manageable, and for a moment, the negotiation found a new balance, one that did not ignore the presence behind Lyra, but incorporated it into the unspoken framework that now guided every interaction. And then, almost imperceptibly, the Karth leader's focus shifted again, not away from Lyra, but through her, back to Ethan, and there was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty, only a measured acknowledgement that carried its own form of respect. and they spoke, not loudly, not formally, but with a clarity that reached every corner of the chamber. "You have not denied it," they said, and the statement was simple, but it carried weight, because it removed the last layer of ambiguity that had allowed the room to pretend this was still a matter of interpretation. And Lyra did not interrupt, did not redirect, because she understood that this moment was not hers to control, and Ethan, after a brief pause, allowed his gaze to shift once more, meeting the Karth leader directly, and there was no tension in his posture, no sign of discomfort, only a quiet acceptance of the attention that had settled on him. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, unremarkable, and entirely steady. "There was nothing to deny," he said, and the words did not raise the volume of the room. They lowered it, drawing everything inward, concentrating awareness into a single point. And the silence that followed was not uncertain, not tense, but complete, as if the chamber itself had acknowledged the statement and found no reason to challenge it. And Lyra felt that silence with a clarity that bordered on understanding, because for the first time since the meeting began, there was no ambiguity left, no assumption to rely on, only reality, quiet, undeniable, and standing exactly one step behind her. The silence did not break, it settled, becoming something stable rather than temporary. And in that stability, the room found a new structure, one that no longer relied on assumption or pretense. And Lyra understood that with a clarity that sharpened her focus rather than distracting it, because now there was nothing left to interpret, only to respond to, and she allowed a brief pause to exist, not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement. Before she spoke again, her voice calm, precise, but carrying a depth that had not been present when the meeting began. "Then we will proceed with clarity," she said, and the statement was simple, but it reframed everything, shifting the conversation from uncertainty to defined awareness. And the Karth leader inclined their head in agreement, their posture reflecting a measured acceptance that carried more weight than any formal concession, because it acknowledged that the discussion had moved beyond its original parameters, and yet would continue regardless. And the outer delegates adjusted once more, their positions stabilizing into a formation that respected distance without appearing to retreat, a quiet alignment that signaled understanding without requiring explanation. And Ethan observed all of this without moving, because movement was no longer necessary. The effect had already been established, and maintaining it required less action than interfering with it. And Lyra felt that presence behind her not as pressure, but as context, a constant that influenced the room in ways she could now anticipate, and she used that awareness carefully, guiding the conversation through its final exchanges with a precision that incorporated the shift rather than resisting it. And the responses she received reflected that adjustment, less resistance, fewer interruptions, a subtle but consistent willingness to conclude rather than prolong. And the Karth leader spoke once more, their tone composed, but carrying a nuance that suggested finality rather than continuation. "Your proposal is acceptable under revised terms," they said, and the phrasing was deliberate, acknowledging change without detailing it. And Lyra inclined her head in acknowledgement, her expression composed, but her eyes steady in a way that reflected complete awareness of how that outcome had been reached. And for a moment, the room held its breath again, not in tension, but in recognition, because everyone present understood, at least partially, what had influenced the shift, even if no one chose to state it aloud. And Ethan remained where he was, unchanged, unremarkable in posture, but no longer unnoticed, and that difference would not fade quickly. And Lyra turned her head slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to speak to him without addressing the room, her voice low, controlled, but carrying a quiet curiosity that had replaced earlier assumption. "You altered the outcome," she said, not accusing, not praising, simply stating what she had observed. And Ethan considered that for a moment before responding, his tone as calm as it had been from the beginning. "The outcome was already there," he said, and he did not elaborate, because elaboration would reduce something that did not need reducing. And Lyra held his gaze for a fraction longer than necessary, absorbing the answer without pressing for more, because she understood now that understanding him would not come from direct questions, but from observation over time. And that realization did not unsettle her, it interested her, in a way that was both controlled and entirely new, and she turned back to the room, her posture settling into its final form, composed, precise, but now carrying a subtle shift that no one could fully define. And as the delegates began to disperse, their movements measured, their conversations quieter than before, the space they left behind did not return to what it had been, because something had changed, not in structure, but in perception, and Lyra knew, with quiet certainty, that when the next negotiation began, the room would remember this one, and Ethan Cole would no longer be considered an invisible detail standing one step behind her.